September 25th, 1852, St. Louis, Missouri. The air itself seemed to hold its breath as carriages rolled up the oak-lined drive of the Gresham plantation. What was meant to be the most glorious celebration in the county's history, a wedding that would unite two of the most powerful slave-trading families in the region, would instead become the final chapter of a dynasty built on blood, tears, and broken spirits. But to understand how it all ended, we need to go back to where it began. We need to go back to a 10-year-old boy standing barefoot in the dirt, about to have his childhood burned away forever. Before we begin tonight's story, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life stories. The sky was the color of old bones the morning they branded Nathaniel, not the promising gray of approaching rain, but the suffocating gray of smoke trapped under low clouds, the kind of morning that made even the cotton fields look ashamed of themselves, stretching endlessly toward a horizon that offered no escape, no hope, only more of the same endless servitude. Nathaniel stood small and defiant in the center of the yard, his ribs showing through skin stretched too thin over growing bones. His mother, Ruth, had tried to feed him extra portions from her own meager plate, but there was never enough. There was never enough of anything on the Gresham plantation except cruelty. Master Landon Gresham stood nearby, his presence like a storm cloud that followed you wherever you went. He didn't need to raise his voice to be terrifying. Power radiated from him like heat from a forge, the kind of power that came from owning not just land but souls. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, each one worth more than most enslaved people would see in a lifetime. Those boots had walked over graves, over dreams, over the broken bodies of anyone who dared to resist. But here's what made this moment different from all the other horrors on the plantation. Nathaniel wasn't just another victim. Even at 10 years old, even facing the branding iron that would mark him as property forever, something burned in his eyes that couldn't be extinguished. The overseers saw it, Gresham saw it, and that's exactly why they had to try to break him. Two overseers grabbed the boy by his thin arms. He fought like a wildcat, scratching and biting, his bare feet kicking up clouds of dust as they dragged him toward the punishment stump. This wasn't just resistance, it was prophecy. Every kick, every desperate struggle was a promise of what was coming. The boy bit down hard on one overseer's hand, drawing blood, tasting the iron flavor of rebellion for the first time. They beat him down until his small body went limp, but even unconscious, Nathaniel's hands were clenched into fists. They dragged him to the stump, the same scarred piece of wood where countless punishments had been administered, where the ghost of every scream still lingered in the air. Ruth tried to run to her son. She made it maybe 3 steps before a backhand sent her sprawling in the dirt. Her scream was short, choked by dust and despair, but it echoed in that yard like a curse. She stayed down, hands shaking in the red earth, forced to watch as they prepared to scar her baby forever. The branding iron came out of the fire glowing like a piece of captured hell. The letter G, carved in reverse on the metal tip, waited to make its mark. G for Gresham, G for ownership, G for a wound that would never heal. No prayers were offered, no words of comfort spoken, just the hiss of flesh burning, a sound that echoed across the plantation like the devil's own laughter. The smell of scorched skin and singed hair hung in the air like incense at an altar of cruelty. Nathaniel passed out from the pain, his 10-year-old mind unable to process the agony, but even in unconsciousness his spirit remained unbroken. When he came to hours later, lying face down on the dirt floor of the slave quarters, the pain had changed. It was no longer just physical agony, it was fuel, it was memory, it was the beginning of something that would one day consume everything Gresham had built. That night, as Nathaniel lay burning with fever, his grandmother Mama Aya came to him. She was ancient, her face mapped with lines that told stories of survival, of endurance, of a strength that couldn't be branded or broken. Her hands, gnarled but gentle, touched the fresh wound on his shoulder. "They gave you their letter," she whispered, her voice like wind through old trees. "But that ain't your name." She pressed her palm over the scar, and Nathaniel felt something pass between them. Not healing, not comfort, but understanding. "You belong to the ones who walked before chains," she continued, "and they watching now, waiting." In the flickering firelight of the quarters, surrounded by the quiet breathing of other broken souls trying to find peace in sleep, Mama Aya began to hum. It was a tune with no words anymore, only memory. A melody that had survived the middle passage, survived the auction blocks, survived every attempt to erase where they came from. But here's what the Greshams didn't understand about the people. They thought they owned. You can brand flesh, but you can't brand spirit. You can chain bodies, but you can't chain the memory of freedom. And in that moment, as his grandmother's ancient song filled the air, Nathaniel began to understand that he was part of something larger than his own pain. The cotton fields whispered secrets in the wind that night. They spoke of other boys who had been branded, other mothers who had screamed, other fathers who had been dragged away, never to return. The fields remembered everything, and they were teaching Nathaniel to remember too. He closed his eyes and made a promise to his father, whose name he barely remembered but whose blood flowed in his veins. He made a promise to his mother, lying in her own corner of the quarters, tears still wet on her cheeks. He made a promise to the brand on his shoulder, that one day it would be a symbol not of ownership, but of retribution. One day Gresham would bleed, but patience is a weapon that takes time to forge, and Nathaniel had to grow into his destiny. Years passed like seasons of suffering. He worked the fields until his hands were leather and his back was steel. He served in the big house, moving like a shadow through rooms filled with luxury built on misery. He listened, he learned, and he waited. The plantation didn't sleep. It breathed. Day and night it pulsed with the rhythm of exploitation. The sound of the whip, the cry of the overseer, the shuffle of feet too tired to lift properly from the ground. But underneath it all, like a heartbeat, was something else. The pulse of resistance, the quiet hum of people who refused to be broken. Nathaniel grew tall and strong, but more importantly, he grew watchful. He learned every corner of the plantation, every hiding place, every weakness in Gresham's armor of cruelty. He knew which floorboards creaked in the big house, which guards drank too much on Saturday nights, which doors were left unlocked when the family slept. And then, one autumn day in 1852, everything began to change. The carriage arrived like a herald of doom, wheels crunching over the gravel drive, pulled by horses whose breath steamed in the cool morning air. From its dark interior stepped a man who looked like he'd been carved from marble and cruelty in equal measure. Thomas Langford, the slave trader from Virginia, had come to claim his prize. Nathaniel watched from behind a row of cotton stalks. As Langford emerged, his coat tailored from the finest materials, his boots polished to a shine that reflected the faces of the people he considered property. Everything about him screamed wealth, built on suffering, power derived from the powerlessness of others. But it wasn't just his appearance that made Nathaniel's blood run cold. It was the way Langford looked at everything around him, cataloging, calculating, seeing not a home but an investment, not people but inventory. Catherine Gresham waited on the porch to greet her betrothed, 20 years old and beautiful in the way that privilege allows. Her dress was blue silk imported from France, her skin pale from a lifetime of staying out of the sun that scorched the backs of those who worked her family's fields. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something that might have been doubt or fear, or the first stirring of a conscience she'd been taught to ignore. The wedding preparations began immediately. The plantation buzzed with activity, as servants scurried to transform the grounds into something worthy of two of the most powerful families in the slave trade. Tents sprouted behind the big house like mushrooms after rain, filled with imported delicacies and wine that cost more than most enslaved people would see in several lifetimes. But Nathaniel wasn't watching the preparations. He was watching the exits. Every path, every door, every shadow became part of a mental map he was drawing for the night that was coming. Because he knew, with the certainty of someone who had been marked by fire and forged by suffering, that this wedding would be the perfect stage for justice. The irony wasn't lost on him that they were building the altar for the ceremony directly over the roots of the old oak tree where his father had been hanged. The tree that had watched so much pain, so much death, would now watch something else entirely. Days passed in a blur of forced celebration. The guest list read like a registry of evil: plantation owners, slave traders, bankers who financed the buying and selling of human souls. They arrived in their finest carriages, wearing their finest clothes, their hands soft and clean despite being stained with the blood of thousands. Nathaniel moved among them like a ghost, serving wine, clearing plates, invisible in the way that those with power prefer their victims to be. But he was far from invisible. He was cataloging every face, memorizing every voice, planning for the night when the bill for their crimes would finally come due. In the kitchen, where the enslaved worked 18-hour days to prepare for the celebration, Nathaniel found what he was looking for. Mama Ia stood over a steaming pot, grinding herbs, with the same hands that had comforted him the night he was branded. Her face was stone, but her eyes burned with an inner fire that matched his own. "I need something," he said quietly, approaching her workstation. "Something that will make a man weak, but not dead. Not yet." She didn't look up from her grinding, but her hands slowed. "Wine will flow at that table tonight," he continued. "I want mine to do more than burn the throat." Mama Ia reached into a hidden pocket in her apron and pulled out a small jar filled with dark powder. She opened it carefully, not breathing in the contents. "One pinch," she warned, her voice barely above a whisper. "Enough to loosen the spine from the soul. More than that, and even the devil won't want the body." Nathaniel took the jar, wrapped it in cloth, and tucked it into his waistband. "Is this the night?" she asked, finally meeting his eyes. "Not yet. he replied, but I'm setting the table. That evening, while the wedding guests danced and celebrated, Nathaniel made his way to the wine cellar. Row upon row of bottles lined the walls. Vintage wines from France and Spain, each one worth more than most people earned in a year. But Nathaniel was looking for one bottle in particular. He found the section where Langford's personal selection was stored, bottles marked with his initials, wines he had specifically requested for the celebration. Nathaniel carefully selected one bottle, uncorked it with practiced skill, and added just a pinch of Mama Ia's powder. The wine turned cloudy for just a moment, then cleared, looking exactly as it had before. He resealed the bottle with wax, placed it back among the others, third from the left, exactly where Langford always chose his evening wine. Then he waited. The rehearsal dinner was a study in arrogance. Langford held court like a king, regaling the guests with stories of his successful acquisitions in Virginia. He spoke of human beings like they were livestock, describing their strengths and weaknesses as if evaluating horses for purchase. Nathaniel served the wine, moving silently among the tables, his face a mask of subservience that hid the fire burning in his chest. When he poured Langford's glass, their eyes met for just a moment. Langford saw nothing but a servant. Nathaniel saw a dead man who just didn't know it yet. "I can smell victory in this wine," Langford declared, raising his glass in a toast to new alliances and profitable ventures. The guests cheered and drank, celebrating their own prosperity built on the suffering of others. But Nathaniel knew that by tomorrow night, at least one of them would never raise another toast. Later, in the quiet of the quarters, Nathaniel sat beside Mama Ia as she worked by firelight, preparing herbs and remedies for ailments both physical and spiritual. The old woman's hands never stopped moving, crushing roots, mixing powders, performing the ancient alchemy that had kept their people alive through centuries of bondage. "Your father carried a blade," she said without looking up from her work. "Small thing, sharp as truth, hidden in the straw of his bed. The night they took him, I dug it up, kept it safe." She reached into a worn leather pouch and pulled out a knife with a bone handle, its blade thin but deadly sharp. The metal was dark with age but gleamed wickedly in the firelight. "This belonged to him," she said, placing it in Nathaniel's hands. "Now it belongs to justice." Nathaniel felt the weight of it, the history in its worn handle, the promise in its sharp edge. This wasn't just a weapon. It was inheritance. It was the completion of something his father had started, the answer to prayers spoken in chains. The night before the wedding, Nathaniel walked the perimeter of the plantation one last time. He stopped at the old oak where his father had died, its branches reaching toward stars that had witnessed too much suffering, too much injustice. "I'll make it right," he whispered to the wind. "I'll make them pay." The tree creaked in the breeze, and for a moment Nathaniel could swear he heard his father's voice carried on the wind, telling him it was time. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and merciless, the sun rising like a witness called to testify. The plantation transformed into a stage, every detail perfect, every flower arranged, every surface polished until it gleamed. It was beautiful in the way that lies can be beautiful when told by expert liars. Guests began arriving early, their carriages forming a parade of wealth and wickedness down the oak-lined drive, men in their finest clothes, women in dresses that cost more than most people's homes, all gathering to celebrate the union of two families whose fortunes were built on human misery. Nathaniel moved among them, serving refreshments, lighting cigars, invisible in the way that those with power preferred their victims to be. But he was far from invisible. Every face he passed he memorized. Every conversation he overheard, he filed away. Every weakness he observed, he catalogued for future use. The ceremony was held in the shadow of the old oak, the tree that had watched his father die, now forced to watch this obscene celebration of the system that had killed him. The irony was so perfect it felt like divine intervention. Catherine stood at the altar in white silk, beautiful and tragic like a marble statue of grief. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her bouquet, the only sign that beneath the perfect exterior was a woman who understood, perhaps for the first time, the true cost of her family's wealth. Langford stood beside her, chest puffed with pride, hand resting on the Bible as if it couldn't burn him where he stood. He spoke his vows like a conqueror claiming territory, each word a declaration of ownership not just over Catherine, but over everything the Gresham name represented. The guests applauded as if they were watching a play, which in a way they were, the final act of a tragedy that had been generations in the making. But the real performance was yet to begin. The reception moved to the great hall of the plantation house, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on walls lined with portraits of Gresham ancestors, stern-faced men and women who had built their legacy on the broken backs of enslaved people. The orchestra played waltzes while couples danced, their feet gliding across floors polished by hands that would never be allowed to dance in this room. Wine flowed like water, expensive vintages chosen to impress guests who measured worth in the suffering of others. Nathaniel moved through it all like like smoke, pouring wine, clearing plates, watching and waiting. He saw Langford reach for his customary bottle, the third from the left, exactly where Nathaniel had placed it. He watched as the man poured himself a generous glass and drank deeply, savoring what he believed was the taste of victory. It would take time for the powder to work, so Nathaniel waited. He served other guests, refilled glasses, played the part of the invisible servant while inside him, the fire of justice burned brighter with every passing moment, and then it began. Langford swayed slightly as he stood to make a toast. At first, it looked like the natural unsteadiness of a man who had been drinking, and his guests laughed good-naturedly. But then he stumbled, caught himself on the edge of the table, and tried to speak. No words came out, only a confused grunt. The laughter died away as Langford's knees buckled and he fell to the floor, his hands clawing at his throat, his eyes wide with confusion and the first taste of fear. The poison wasn't killing him, not yet, but it was stripping away his control, his power, his ability to command and intimidate. Nathaniel moved quickly, kneeling beside the fallen man. "He needs air," he said to the concerned guests. "Let me help him outside." No one questioned a servant offering assistance. They were too shocked, too confused, too focused on their own comfort to think clearly. Nathaniel helped Langford to his feet and half carried him toward the side door, away from the crowd, away from help, toward the darkness where justice waited. Once they were outside, away from the lights and the music and the witnesses, Nathaniel let Langford fall. The man hit the ground hard, his fine clothes now stained with dirt and his own saliva. He tried to speak, but the words came out as meaningless sounds. Nathaniel knelt beside him and pulled out his father's blade. In the moonlight, it looked like a piece of captured starfire, sharp and clean and ready. "Do you remember this?" Nathaniel asked, pressing the tip of the knife against the brand on his own shoulder. "Do you remember what you people do to children?" Langford's eyes widened as understanding dawned. He tried to crawl away, but his limbs wouldn't obey him properly. The poison had stolen his coordination, his strength, his ability to escape the consequences of his actions. "You made cages for children," Nathaniel continued, his voice calm as death itself. "You bought women like cattle. You turned suffering into profit and called it business." He leaned closer, so close that Langford could see the fire burning in his eyes, the absolute certainty of a man who had found his purpose. "This land doesn't belong to men like you," Nathaniel whispered. "It never did." The blade went in clean and deep, piercing the heart that had never felt compassion for another human being. Langford's mouth opened in a silent scream, his body convulsing once before going still. The stars looked down on his corpse and felt no sorrow. Nathaniel cleaned the blade on Langford's expensive coat, then stood and looked back toward the plantation house. Light and music still poured from the windows, the celebration continuing without the guest of honor. Soon they would notice his absence. Soon they would search, but not yet. He had one more task to complete. Nathaniel walked back into the hall, moving with the same careful invisibility he had perfected over years of servitude. The guests were still drinking, still laughing, still celebrating their own prosperity. Catherine stood alone near a window, staring out at the night as if she could see the future approaching like a storm. He crossed the room without permission, without invitation, the crowd parting before him like water. When he reached Catherine, the music faltered and died. Every eye in the room turned toward them, sensing that something fundamental had shifted. "Is he dead?" Catherine asked quietly, not turning to face him. Nathaniel nodded. "Yes." She closed her eyes, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure cracked. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Not everything. Not how deep it went." "You didn't ask," Nathaniel replied, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence of the room. Behind them, guests began to murmur, some reaching for weapons, others backing toward the exits, but no one moved to stop him. Something in Nathaniel's bearing, some quality of absolute certainty, kept them frozen. He pulled out his father's blade, holding it low but visible. Several people gasped, but still no one acted. "My mother died screaming under this roof," he said, his words carrying to every corner of the room. "My father swung from that tree because he dared to speak truth to power. I carry them in me, their pain, their dreams, their unfinished business." Catherine turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "What happens now?" Nathaniel looked at the blade in his hand, then at her face, young and beautiful, and finally, truly awake to the horror her family had created. "Now you live with the weight of what you've learned," he said. "Dying would be easy. Living with the truth, that's the harder punishment." He turned away from her and walked toward the door, passing Master Gresham, who stood frozen like a statue of impotent rage. At the threshold, Nathaniel paused and looked back one last time. "The Gresham name dies tonight," he announced to the room. "Not in blood, but in truth. When the sun rises, everyone will know what you really are." And with that, he stepped out into the night, leaving behind a room full of people who had finally seen the face place of justice. But Nathaniel's work wasn't finished. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about liberation. And there was one more thing he had to do before the night was over. He walked to the old storage shed behind the big house, the place where the real business of the plantation was conducted. Inside, stacked floor to ceiling, were the records of 3 generations of human trafficking, ledgers filled with names, ages, prices paid and received, bills of sale for human beings, breeding records, punishment logs, the complete documentation of systematic evil. Nathaniel lit a match and touched it to the corner of the oldest ledger. The flame caught quickly, spreading from page to page, consuming the names of the bought and sold, the records of the traded and tortured. The fire grew brighter, hungrier, as if it too understood the justice of what was happening. The flames spread to the walls, to the roof, turning night into day with their fierce light. From inside the plantation house came shouts and screams as people realized what was happening, but it was too late to stop it. Nathaniel stood in the doorway of the burning shed, silhouetted against the flames like an angel of vengeance. The fire roared behind him, consuming not just paper and wood but the very foundation of the Gresham Empire. As dawn broke over the plantation, smoke still rose from the ruins of the shed. The records were gone, burned to ash that the wind scattered across fields that had drunk too much blood and tears. Without their documentation, the Greshams couldn't prove ownership of anything or anyone. Soldiers came eventually, but they found only a man standing at the edge of the cotton fields, his back straight, his head high, his hands empty. Nathaniel didn't run, didn't hide, didn't resist. He had done what he came to do. The official records would say that Thomas Langford died in an accident, that the fire was caused by a lamp knocked over in the confusion. The truth was too dangerous, too revolutionary, too inspiring to be allowed to spread. But the people knew. In the slave quarters of 100 plantations, the story was told in whispers. How one man had stood up to the system that crushed them all. How the fire that burned the Gresham records had lit something that could never be extinguished. Nathaniel disappeared into legend after that night. Some said he was killed by the soldiers. Others claimed he escaped north, carrying his father's blade and the fire of justice with him. But the truth was simpler and more powerful than any legend. The truth was that on September 25th, 1852, a dynasty built on human suffering finally paid the price for its crimes. The Gresham name, once burned into the flesh of the powerless, was itself burned away, scattered like ash on the wind of change that was coming to tear down everything they had built. And somewhere in the smoke and flames of that night, the spirit of justice itself seemed to whisper, "The reckoning has begun." This is the story they don't want you to know. The story of how one man's courage lit a fire that would eventually consume the entire system of slavery. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from courts or governments or laws. Sometimes it comes from the hands of those who have suffered most, carrying the weight of truth and the promise that no one, no matter how powerful, can escape the consequences of their actions forever.